Your little dirt hole is a public nuisance and a structural liability, Mr. Caldwell. We're having it filled with concrete by Friday, and the $5,000 special assessment will be added to your dues. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and suffocating, spoken with the casual tyranny of a queen bee addressing a drone. Karen Miller, president of the Meadows at Liberty Crossing Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property line as if an inch further would soil her pristine white sneakers. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s, built like a linebacker squeezed into a pastel pink tracksuit, her face a permanent mask of pinched disapproval. Her clipboard, the scepter of her suburban kingdom, was clutched in a white-knuckled grip. She pointed a perfectly manicured but stubby finger at the old stone-lined entrance to my root cellar, a structure that had been nestled into the gentle slope of my backyard for well over a century. A dirt hole. Lit a fuse deep inside me. A place that lit a fuse deep inside me. A place that had been quiet for a long time. If you think that sounds insane, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've got an HOA nightmare of your own. You won't believe where this goes. I bought this place, or rather, inherited it and bought out my sister's share, 3 years ago, after 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Master Sergeant Mark Caldwell, retired. It was my grandfather's homestead, 5 acres of rolling Virginia countryside that had somehow resisted the relentless creep of suburban development. The main house was a sturdy 1920s farmhouse I'd been slowly restoring, but the real heart of the property for me was the outbuildings, the old barn, the smokehouse, and the root cellar. My grandfather, a man of few words and many calluses, had taught me how to work this land. He taught me the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of a straight fence line, the deep peace of a well-stocked pantry. After my last tour in Afghanistan, the quiet and the work were the only things that could smooth out the jagged edges in my mind. Here, I wasn't Master Sergeant Caldwell, responsible for the lives of my soldiers and the integrity of a multi-million-dollar forward operating base. I was just Mark, grandson of a farmer, tending his garden. The HOA, the Meadows at Liberty Crossing, was a cancer that had metastasized around my property. My 5 acres were grandfathered in, an island of authentic history in a sea of cookie-cutter vinyl-sided McMansions. I wasn't technically a member, but a bizarre clause in the county development plan gave them architectural oversight on any property bordering their precious community. A fact I discovered only after a protracted legal back and forth when I wanted to repaint my barn its original historic red. Karen Miller had fought me tooth and nail, insisting on a more harmonious shade of beige. I'd won that battle with a historical society letter and a stubborn refusal to bend, but it had put me squarely in her crosshairs. She saw my property not as a piece of local heritage, but as a blight, a stubborn weed in her perfectly manicured garden of conformity. And the root cellar, with its weathered fieldstone and heavy timber door was, in her eyes, the ugliest weed of all. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. My training taught me to control the engagement, to never let an opponent's aggression dictate my response. I let her smug certainty fester in the quiet. "That cellar was built in the 1860s, Karen," I said, my voice low and even. "It predates your entire development by 130 years. It predates the invention of the internal combustion engine. It is part of the original property." She waved a dismissive hand. "History is no excuse for violating the covenants, Mr. Caldwell. Section 4, subsection B, clearly states that all detached structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Your dirt hole is an unapproved, unsafe, and frankly unsightly structure. It lowers property values." She said property values with the hushed reverence some people reserve for prayer. It was the HOA's holy scripture. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the glee she took in wielding this petty power. This wasn't about safety or aesthetics. This was a power play, a campaign to bring the last bastion of nonconformity to heel. She wanted to tame my land, to pave over its history and paint it beige. And destroying that cellar was her symbolic first strike. She thought she was dealing with some old broken-down vet who'd just roll over. She was about to learn in excruciating detail that a master sergeant in the Corps of Engineers is an expert in 2 things: building things up and tearing things down. And right now I was drawing up the demolition plans for her little empire. The official notice arrived the next day, delivered by a sneering teenager in a golf cart with the HOA logo on the side. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation, printed on heavy cream-colored letterhead and full of pseudo-legal jargon designed to overwhelm and disorient. Notice of covenant violation and remediation order, it screamed in a bold serif font. It listed the infractions. Unapproved auxiliary structure, Bylaw 4.2, failure to maintain aesthetic uniformity as stated Bylaw 7.9, and my personal favorite, potential vector for vermin and pests, Bylaw 9.4. It was absurd. The cellar was solid stone and oak, sealed tighter than a drum. The only vermin I'd ever seen on this property were the HOA board members conducting their monthly compliance patrols from the comfort of their golf carts. The notice gave me 14 days to submit a plan of demolition to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. If the structure wasn't completely removed and the land graded and seeded within 30 days, the daily fines of $100 would commence, along with a special assessment for forced remediation, which was her $5,000 concrete threat. I sat at my grandfather's old oak desk, the letter spread out before me like an enemy's battle plan. My first instinct, the raw, visceral one, was to march over to her house, nail this piece of paper to her front door, and dare her to set 1 foot on my property. But that was the grunt's response. The NCO's response was different. You don't meet a prepared defense with a frontal assault. You probe for weaknesses. You use their own tactics against them. You drown them in the very process they worship. So I decided to play her game. I would give the Architectural Review Committee an application so detailed, so professional, so utterly overwhelming that they would have no choice but to choke on it. For the next 3 days, I treated this task like a mission briefing. I took high-resolution photographs of the root cellar from every conceivable angle. I used my old engineering software to draw up detailed architectural plans, including cross-sections of the stonework and schematics of the timber framing. I wrote a 10-page historical summary, citing its construction methods as typical of mid-19th century German immigrant masonry in the Shenandoah Valley. I included a soil stability report from a local engineering firm I had on retainer for some barn foundation work, confirming the structure was sounder than most of the houses in her development. I even included a pest control report certifying the cellar was free of any vermin. I compiled it all into a 3-ring binder, complete with a table of contents, index tabs, and a cover sheet that read, Retroactive Application for Historical Structure, Preservation, Caldwell Homestead Root Cellar, Block 4, Lot 1. It was a work of art. It was bureaucratic, malicious compliance. When I was finished, I walked over to the HOA's sterile little office in the community clubhouse. Karen was there, holding court with 2 of her board member cronies, a mousy woman named Brenda, and a pompous man named Gary, who always wore a polo shirt tucked into his pleated khaki shorts. The air was thick with the scent of potpourri and self-importance. I placed the binder on the counter with a solid, satisfying thud. It was 3 inches thick. Karen looked at it, then at me, her eyes narrowing. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "It's my application for the ARC," I said plainly. "As requested, I believe you'll find it exceeds all submission requirements." Gary picked it up, grunting at its weight. He flipped through a few pages, his brow furrowed in confusion at the detailed engineering diagrams. "This is a lot," he mumbled. "I'm a thorough man," I replied, looking directly at Karen. "I look forward to the committee's fair and impartial review at the next meeting." I turned and walked out, leaving the binder sitting there like an unexploded ordnance. They wanted a paper war? I was about to give them a library of it. I knew they wouldn't approve it. This was never about the process. But now their rejection would be a documented act of bad faith, another piece of evidence in the file I was meticulously building against them. The first brick in the trap was laid. The ARC meeting was held a week later in the clubhouse conference room, a soul-crushing beige box decorated with motivational posters about community and teamwork. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a trowel. I sat at one end of a long laminate table, my 3-inch binder of an application placed squarely in front of me. At the other end sat the committee. Karen, in her role as HOA, a Bodbeidao president and de facto dictator, flanked by Gary, Brenda, and 2 other residents who looked either terrified of her or bored out of their minds. It was clear from the outset that this was a show trial. My binder was sitting on the corner of the table, unopened. They hadn't even bothered to look at it. Karen called the meeting to order with a rap of her gavel that was far too aggressive for the small room. After dealing with a few mundane items, the approval of a new mailbox design, a lengthy debate on the acceptable color palette for deck stain, they finally reached my agenda item. Next, Karen announced, her gaze flicking towards me with undisguised contempt. We have the application from Mr. Caldwell regarding the unapproved structure at 1412 Liberty Lane. Gary cleared his throat, picking up a single sheet of paper. The committee has reviewed the situation, he began, lying through his teeth, and while we appreciate the detail of the submission, he trailed off, clearly not knowing what to say. Karen cut him off. The structure is a clear violation of aesthetic standards, she declared, as if speaking the word of God. It does not conform to the visual harmony of the meadows at Liberty Crossing. It is old, it is dilapidated, and it is an eyesore. The committee's position is unchanged. I held my ground, keeping my voice steady. Did the committee review the structural engineering report confirming its stability, or the historical analysis detailing its significance to the original homestead? Karen waved a dismissive hand. We don't need to read a novel to know what we see with our own eyes, Mr. Caldwell. This is a community of modern, well-maintained homes. A primitive hole in the ground does not fit that vision. The other members just nodded along, their faces blank. This was pure autocracy. My evidence, my logic, my adherence to their own ridiculous process, it meant nothing. The decision had been made before I ever walked in the door. So to be clear, I stated, making sure my words were precise for the record I was building in my head, you are officially denying this application without having reviewed the submitted materials? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Gary's face, but Karen shot him a look that could curdle milk. The application is denied, she said with a finality. The remediation order stands. You have 14 days from this date to comply. The gavel cracked against the table again. Meeting adjourned, I sat there for a moment as they gathered their papers and filed out, avoiding my eyes. It was exactly what I expected, but the sheer brazen arrogance of it still managed to astound me. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were enjoying the act of crushing dissent. 2 days later, the next letter arrived. This one was even more aggressive. It formally stated the denial and reiterated that I had until the 28th of the month to completely and permanently remove the offending structure. The daily fines of $100 would begin on the 29th. They had also helpfully included a list of HOA-approved contractors for demolition and excavation, a list I was sure was populated by friends and relatives of the board. It was then that I knew reasoning was pointless. This was a campaign of attrition. They planned to bury me in fines and legal fees until I either gave in or sold the property. It was time to open a new front. I reached out to a few people I'd gotten to know. The first was Arthur Abernathy, a retired high school history teacher who lived 3 doors down. He was a kind, thoughtful man who was fascinated by the history of my property. The second was a young couple, the Garcias, who had moved in last year. I'd seen Karen berating Maria Garcia in her own driveway because her children's plastic slide was visible from the street. They were good people, just trying to raise a family, who were being terrorized by this suburban despot. I invited them over for coffee on my back porch. I laid out the letters, the application, the whole story. Arthur was aghast. This is an outrage, Mark. That cellar is a piece of living history. To destroy it would be an act of cultural vandalism. Maria Garcia just shook her head. She's a bully. Last month we got a fine because our garbage can was put out 2 hours before the approved time. 2 hours. We're paying thousands a year in dues to be treated like children. That was the spark. We talked for over an hour, sharing stories of Karen's petty tyrannies. It turned out her reign was more extensive than I knew. Fines for the wrong type of mulch, violations for holiday decorations left up a day too long, warnings for grass that was a 1/4 inch too high. It was a pattern of harassment and control. She uses the rules to target anyone she doesn't like, Miguel Garcia said, his jaw tight. And no one challenges her because they're afraid of the fines and the hassle. Well, I said, taking a sip of my coffee, I'm not afraid of the hassle. Arthur Abernathy leaned forward, a glint in his eye. What's your plan, Mark? There has to be more to this than just fighting them on their own terms. I gave them a small, tight smile. I'm working on that. I think it's time to do a little historical research of my own. They didn't know the half of it. I wasn't just researching. I was excavating. I was looking for the ammunition that would not just stop this, but end it for good. The paper war was about to become a historical reckoning. My grandfather was a man who saved everything. He wasn't a hoarder, but he believed that every object, every piece of paper, had a story. The attic of the old farmhouse was a testament to that belief. It was hot and smelled of dry wood and aging paper, a library of a long life. I'd been up there a few times to fetch seasonal decorations, but I'd never truly explored its depths. Now I had a mission. I was looking for anything related to the property's history, any old document that might give me an edge. For hours, I sorted through dusty boxes, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I found my grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a cedar chest. I found my own elementary school report cards and my father's Boy Scout merit badges. It was a journey through my own family's past, a poignant distraction from the present conflict. Then I found it. Tucked away in the corner was a heavy black steamer trunk with brass fittings. Stenciled on the side was my great-grandfather's name, Elias Caldwell. I pried open the stiff latches. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten wool blankets, were stacks of leather-bound ledgers, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, and several cardboard boxes full of brittle, yellow documents. It was the administrative history of the Caldwell farm. I spent the rest of the day and most of the night at the dining room table, carefully sifting through the contents of that trunk. I found the original deed from 1852. I found farm logs detailing crop yields and livestock sales from the 1880s. It was fascinating, but it wasn't the weapon I was looking for. Finally, in a box labeled Correspondence and Sundry, my fingers brushed against a manila folder that was thicker than the rest. The label, written in my grandfather's neat cursive, simply said, "The Cellar." My heart began to beat a little faster. I opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of papers, all related to the root cellar. There were hand-drawn sketches of its construction, notes on repairs made in the 1930s, and then the correspondence. It was a series of letters from the late 1970s, exchanged between my grandfather and a Dr. Alistair Finch, a history professor at the University of Virginia. Dr. Finch had been researching local participation in the Underground Railroad. The letters were a revelation. According to the professor's research, which was based on diaries and church records from the era, my great-great-grandfather, a staunch abolitionist, had used the root cellar as a hiding place for escaped slaves making their way north. It was a stop on a little-known route, a dangerous secret kept by a handful of local families. The professor referred to it as the Caldwell Station. This wasn't just a place to store potatoes and preserves. This was a sanctuary. This was a monument to courage and defiance. My hands were trembling slightly as I read on. The letters detailed Finch's excitement, his request for photographs, his plans to visit. And then I saw the document that made the world stop. It was a thick cardstock certificate, embossed with an official-looking seal. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "United States Department of the Interior, National Park Service." Below that it read, "This is to certify that the Caldwell Homestead Root Cellar has been entered on the National Register of Historic Places." The date on the certificate was October 12th, 1978. I just stared at it. My quiet, unassuming grandfather had worked with a university professor to have his root cellar, his dirt hole, officially recognized and protected by the United States federal government. And in all the years he'd been alive, in all our conversations about the farm, he had never once mentioned it. He was a humble man, not one for accolades. To him, it was probably just a piece of paper. He'd done what he thought was right to preserve the family history and then filed it away and went back to his work. But to me, in that moment, that certificate was the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Rosetta Stone, and the Declaration of Independence all rolled into one. It was the kill shot. Karen Miller and her petty HOA weren't just threatening to destroy my property. They were threatening to commit a federal crime. A deep, cold calm settled over me, the kind of calm that comes before a storm, when you know you have overwhelming firepower and the enemy is walking blindly into your kill zone. The anger I'd felt was replaced by something else, a grim, focused sense of purpose. This was no longer a dispute, it was an operation, and the objective was total victory. The first rule of any engagement is to know your weapon and its capabilities before you deploy it. I didn't storm over to Karen's house, waving the certificate in her face. That would have been a waste of a perfectly good ambush. Instead, my first call the next morning was to the Virginia State Historic Preservation Office. I was connected to a man named Arthur Vance, a senior preservation officer who sounded like he'd spent his entire life in dusty archives and loved every minute of it. I explained the situation, the existence of the registered site, the HOA's condemnation order, their threat to fill it with concrete. There was a long, horrified silence on the other end of the line. "They want to do what?" he finally sputtered. "Mr. Caldwell, are you aware of the penalties for something like that?" "I have a general idea," I said, "but I'd appreciate it if you could give me the specifics." For the next 20 minutes, Mr. Vance gave me a detailed, chapter and verse education on historic preservation law. He confirmed the site's status on the National Register. He explained that under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and further codified in USOS Code Title 54, the willful damage or destruction of a registered property was a felony. He talked about civil penalties from the state, criminal charges from the Department of Justice, and the personal liability of every single individual involved in the decision-making process. The board members, the management company, even the driver of the concrete truck could be held liable, he explained, his voice filled with a kind of righteous fury. This isn't like forgetting to mow your lawn. This is destroying a piece of American history. We take that very seriously. He emailed me a packet of information, including links to the specific federal and state statutes. He gave me his direct line and told me to call him the second the HOA made another move. My next call was to Dave Martinez. Dave and I had served together in Iraq. He was a sharp, aggressive JAG officer who had left the Army to start his own successful law firm. He specialized in contract law, but he had a pit bull's love for a good fight, especially against a bully. I laid out the whole story, from Karen's first threat to the discovery in the attic. When I told him about the National Register certificate, he let out a low whistle. "Oh, Mark, my friend," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "This is a thing of beauty. This isn't just a slam dunk. This is taking the backboard with you. They have no idea what they've stepped in." We formulated a plan, a two-pronged attack. Phase 1 was to continue baiting the trap to let the HOA dig its own grave deeper. Phase 2 would be the public, legal, and administrative hammer blow. On Dave's advice, I did not reveal the certificate. Instead, he drafted a formal, legally precise letter to the HOA board. It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It didn't threaten or accuse. It simply requested, for the purposes of ensuring full compliance and exploring all possible avenues for resolution, a detailed written justification for the condemnation order. It asked them to cite the specific county building codes they believed the Cellar violated, the engineering reports they had commissioned to declare it a structural liability, and the evidence they had gathered to classify it as a vermin risk. Every line was a carefully crafted legal landmine. It was designed to force them to either admit they had no evidence or to fabricate it, committing fraud. We sent the letter via certified mail, addressed to Karen and each board member individually. Now we waited. While the legal gears were slowly turning, I moved on the community front. I called another meeting with Arthur Abernathy and the Garcias. This time, I showed them the certificate. Arthur's eyes went wide. He held the document with the reverence of a scholar handling a sacred text. "My word, Mark. The Caldwell Station. This is incredible. This changes everything." Maria Garcia's reaction was more pragmatic. They are going to look like the biggest fools in the state, she said with a slow, satisfied smile. We knew we needed more than just a legal victory. We needed to win the hearts and minds of the community. Arthur, with his passion for history, took the lead. He went to the County Historical Society in the public library's local history room. He came back with old maps showing my property as the original Caldwell farmstead and newspaper clippings from the 1970s about Professor Finch's research. He was building a second public-facing file of evidence. Meanwhile, the Garcias and I started talking to more neighbors, quietly, one-on-one. We didn't lead with my story. We led by asking about theirs. And the stories poured out. We heard about the single mother fined because her son's bicycle was left on the lawn overnight. We heard about the elderly couple forced to pay thousands to replace perfectly healthy shrubs because they weren't on the HOA's approved plant list. We discovered that Karen's brother-in-law's landscaping company, Prestige Lawn Care, had an exclusive no-bid contract for all common areas and was charging nearly double the market rate. The picture that emerged was not of a well-meaning board enforcing rules, but of a corrupt regime using its power for personal enrichment and vendettas. We started a private Facebook group, Liberty Crossing Homeowners for Reform. Within a week, we had over 40 members. People were posting photos of their violation notices, sharing their stories, and realizing for the first time that they weren't alone. A rebellion was brewing, quietly and digitally. A week after we sent Dave's letter, the HOA's response arrived. It was exactly what we'd hoped for. Dripping with condescension and arrogance, it was written by Karen herself, not a lawyer. It dismissed our request for evidence as a delaying tactic. It stated that the board's first-hand observation was sufficient evidence of the violations and that their authority under the covenants was absolute and not subject to appeal. She had put it in writing. She had documented her own negligence and bad faith. She had signed her own confession. Dave's reaction when I read it to him over the phone was pure, unadulterated joy. She signed it herself, oh Karen, you magnificent idiot. He laughed. That's it. The trap is set. The bait is taken. Now we just wait for them to show up with the shovels. The morning of the 28th dawned clear and bright, the kind of beautiful late spring May that felt entirely at odds with the confrontation I knew was coming. The deadline had arrived. I sat on my front porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, my nerves a tightly coiled spring. This was it. The moment of truth. I had my own binder ready on the small table next to me, its contents far more potent than the one I had submitted to the ARC. Inside, in neatly organized tabs, were copies of the National Register certificate, the relevant federal and state statutes highlighted in yellow, the email correspondence with the State Historic Preservation Office, the certified mail receipts from Dave's letter, and the HOA's arrogant, dismissive response. It was a complete narrative of their impending self-destruction. At precisely 9 a.m., I heard the rumble. It started as a low growl and grew into the unmistakable groan of a heavy-duty diesel engine. A massive canary yellow concrete truck from Apex Concrete Solutions lumbered down the street, its mixing drum slowly churning. It pulled to a stop directly in front of my property, its air brakes hissing like an angry dragon. Behind it, in a pristine white SUV with an HOA logo magnet slapped on the door, was Karen. She emerged from the driver's seat like a general arriving to survey a conquered territory. She was wearing a power suit today, a vibrant fuchsia that seemed to vibrate with aggressive energy. With her were Gary and Brenda, her loyal lieutenants, looking smug and self-satisfied. A few neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to drift out of their homes, watching from their lawns with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The Garcias and Mr. Abernathy were among them, standing together, a silent show of support. The truck driver, a burly man with a weary expression, hopped down from his cab and conferred with Karen, who pointed dramatically at my root cellar. He nodded, then began to unhitch the long chutes from the back of his vehicle. This was the point of no return. I stood up, picked up my binder, and walked calmly down my driveway to meet them at the edge of my property. I stopped right at the surveyed property line. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice even. "That's as far as that truck goes." She gave a short, barking laugh. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, you're still trying to fight this? It's over. Your time is up. The remediation has been ordered and paid for." Now, I suggest you step back onto your property and let these gentlemen do their work, unless you want to add interfering with an HOA contractor to your list of violations." I ignored her and addressed the driver directly. "Sir," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air, "I need to inform you that the structure you are about to destroy is a federally protected historic site. If you proceed, you and your company will be complicit in a felony offense under U.S. Code Title 54. The driver paused, his hand on a chute clamp. He looked from me to Karen, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Karen's face began to turn a shade that clashed horribly with her fuchsia suit. "He's lying. He's just trying to intimidate you. You work for us," she shrieked at the driver. I opened my binder. "I'm not lying." I presented the first page to her, holding it so the neighbors could see. It was the high-quality color copy of the National Register of Historic Places certificate. "This is the official registration, filed in 1978. As of this moment, you are officially on notice." Her eyes scanned the document, her brain struggling to process what it was seeing. The smugness on her face dissolved, replaced by a wave of confusion then anger. "This is fake," she sputtered, her voice losing its commanding tone. "You printed this off the internet. It's a forgery." "It's not," I said calmly, turning the page. "And this is a copy of the federal law that makes destroying it a crime. I've highlighted the relevant sections for you. It mentions 5 years in federal prison and fines up to $250,000 per person." I made a point of looking directly at Gary and Brenda. Their triumphant expressions had vanished, replaced with identical masks of pale, dawning horror. Brenda looked like she was about to be sick. Gary was staring at the legal text as if it were a venomous snake. The concrete truck driver had now taken a full step back from his truck. He wanted no part of this. He held his hands up. "Whoa, whoa, federal prison? Nobody said anything about federal prison. I'm just paid to deliver concrete." Karen was cornered, her authority evaporating in the public sunlight. Humiliation was turning to pure rage. "This is ridiculous. I am the president of this HOA. I am in charge here." It was then that Mr. Abernathy chose his moment. He stepped forward from the crowd of neighbors, his voice resonating with the authority of a lifelong educator. "She's right to call it ridiculous," he called out. "It is ridiculous that our HOA president is so ignorant of our community's history that she would try to destroy its most significant landmark. The Caldwell Station was a beacon of hope and freedom, and she wants to fill it with concrete." A murmur went through the crowd. People were looking at Karen differently now, not as an authority figure, but as an ignorant bully. Her power was built on a foundation of perceived legitimacy, and that foundation was crumbling into dust right here on my lawn. Cornered, humiliated, and stripped of her authority in front of the very people she lorded it over, Karen did what all failing tyrants do. She escalated irrationally. She snatched her phone from her pocket, her fingers stabbing at the screen. "That's it. You are threatening me. You're threatening this poor worker. I'm calling the police," she screeched, putting the phone to her ear. It was the single greatest strategic error she could have possibly made. I had hoped for this, planned for it, but I never imagined she would walk into it so willingly. Inviting a higher impartial authority onto the scene was the last thing she should have done. While she was hysterically telling a 911 dispatcher that she was being accosted by a belligerent homeowner, I just stood there, binder in hand, a picture of calm. The concrete truck driver had retreated to his cab, talking animatedly on his own phone, likely to his dispatcher and boss, telling them the job was on hold indefinitely. Gary and Brenda were huddled together, whispering furiously, inching away from Karen as if her meltdown was contagious. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, drawn by the drama. They were all watching, all listening. This was no longer a private dispute, it was a public spectacle, and Karen was the star, though not in the way she intended. 2 county sheriff's department cruisers arrived within 10 minutes, lights off, pulling up quietly. 2 deputies got out, a seasoned, weary-looking older officer and a younger, sharper-looking one. They surveyed the scene, the concrete truck, the cluster of board members, the crowd of onlookers, and me, standing my ground. The senior deputy, whose name tag read Sergeant Miller, no relation thankfully, approached Karen first. Ma'am, we got a call about a disturbance? Karen launched into a breathless, exaggerated tirade. She painted me as an unstable, aggressive man who had come out of his house screaming, making threats, and preventing an honest man from doing his job. She waved her hands, pointed at me, at the cellar, at the truck. It was a grand performance, full of righteous indignation. The deputies listened patiently, their expressions unreadable. When she finally wound down, Sergeant Miller turned to me. Sir, what's your side of the story? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gesticulate. I simply opened my binder and said, Sir, this is a civil and, as it turns out, a federal matter. This woman, acting as HOA president, hired this company to fill that root cellar with concrete. I pointed to the stone structure. This is the root cellar. It is a registered National Historic Place and has been since 1978. Destroying it is a felony. I handed the binder to the younger deputy. In there, you'll find the certificate of registration, the applicable federal and state laws, and all my correspondence with the HOA on this matter. The younger deputy took the binder and began to read, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the certificate and the legal statutes. Sergeant Miller looked from me to Karen, his experienced eyes weighing the two of us. He saw a frantic, emotional woman making wild accusations and a calm, organized man presenting documented evidence. It wasn't a hard calculation to make. A historic site, he asked me. Yes, sir, I replied. It was used as a stop on the Underground Railroad. They call it the Caldwell Station. The younger deputy looked up from the binder. He's right, Sarge. This all looks legit. National Park Service seal and everything. Sergeant Miller nodded slowly, a look of profound weariness on his face. He had seen this kind of neighborhood drama 100 times, but never with a twist like this. He turned back to Karen, his voice now devoid of any warmth. Ma'am, is it true that you ordered this structure to be filled with concrete? Of course it's true, she blustered, sensing the tide had turned against her. It's a violation of our covenants. It's my duty to enforce. Ma'am, the sergeant interrupted, his voice firm. Based on the documents I'm seeing, what you call a covenant violation, the federal government calls a protected historic landmark. There is no crime being committed here by Mr. Caldwell. However, if you were to proceed, you and everyone involved could be facing some very serious charges. I strongly advise you to send this gentleman and his truck away and consult with an attorney. Karen's face, which had been fluctuating between shades of red and purple, seemed to collapse. It was the look of absolute total defeat. The public humiliation was complete. She had called the authorities to vanquish her enemy, and they had just publicly declared him the victor and her the potential criminal. She stood there, speechless, as Sergeant Miller walked over to the concrete truck driver, explained the situation, and formally suggested he leave the scene. The driver needed no further encouragement. He started his engine, and with a final, apologetic look in my direction, he began the laborious process of turning his massive truck around and driving away. The sight of that truck retreating down the street was the image of Karen's power in full, ignominious retreat. The war was over. The mopping up operation was about to begin. The departure of the concrete truck was like a dam breaking. The immediate threat was gone, but now a flood of consequences was about to be unleashed. The crowd of neighbors didn't disperse. Instead, they started talking amongst themselves, looking at Karen, Gary, and Brenda with open hostility. The three of them stood isolated on the sidewalk, a trio of disgraced monarchs. Karen, for her part, seemed to shrink before our eyes, the fuchsia power suit now looking like a deflated costume. She stammered something incoherent, then practically they ran to her SUV and sped away. Gary and Brenda scurried off in the opposite direction on foot, not even looking back. The next morning, Dave Martinez filed the lawsuit. It was a comprehensive legal assault, naming the HOA the management company, and Karen Miller, Gary Peterson, and Brenda Howe as individual defendants. The charges included harassment, conspiracy to commit destruction of property, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Dave also filed for a temporary restraining order to prevent any further action by the HOA against me or my property, which a judge granted almost immediately. But the legal front was only part of the strategy. The public relations front exploded. Mr. Abernathy had, with my permission, contacted a reporter at the local paper he knew from his time on the school board. The story was a journalist's dream. Local veteran defends Civil War landmark from overzealous HOA. It ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. The reporter, a young woman with a sharp eye for a good story, did a fantastic job. She included pictures of the root cellar, quotes from a visibly impressed Mr. Abernathy about its historical significance, and a summary of my calm, documented attempts to resolve the issue peacefully. She also included a no comment from the HOA's management company and noted that Karen Miller did not return her calls. The story was picked up by a regional television station. Suddenly, my quiet little farmstead had news vans parked down the street. I gave one, and only one, interview. I stood in front of the cellar, dressed in a simple button-down shirt, and calmly told the story. I talked about my grandfather, about the history of the land, and about the importance of respecting that history. I never raised my voice, never called Karen names. I simply laid out the facts and let her actions speak for themselves. The effect was devastating for the HOA. Their phones and the phones of their national management company began ringing off the hook. The story went viral on social media within the state. The Liberty Crossing Homeowners for Reform Facebook group ballooned to over 200 members, nearly half the households in the development. The narrative was set. The HOA was a villainous cabal of ignorant bullies, and I was the stoic veteran defending American history. Under the crushing weight of the lawsuit and the horrendous publicity, the HOA's management company finally acted. They sent in a team from their corporate office who immediately suspended Karen, Gary, and Brenda from all board duties, pending an investigation. It was a transparent attempt at damage control, but it was also a clear sign that the regime had fallen. Our newly empowered homeowners committee seized the opportunity. Using the bylaws Karen had so often weaponized against us, we collected signatures and formally petitioned for a special meeting of the entire association with one item on the agenda: the recall of the entire board of directors. We had the required number of signatures within 48 hours. The meeting was scheduled for the following week in the local high school auditorium to accommodate the expected crowd. It was standing room only. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of anger and empowerment. The corporate suits from the management company tried to run the meeting, but the residents quickly took control. One by one, homeowners stood up and approached a microphone in the center aisle to share their stories of harassment, exorbitant fines, and the board's lack of transparency. The Garcias spoke about the fines over their child's toys. The elderly widow whose lawn had been condemned spoke, her voice trembling with anger, about the thousands of dollars she was forced to spend. A forensic accountant who lived in the neighborhood and had joined our cause presented a preliminary analysis of the HOA's finances, raising serious questions about the no-bid contracts awarded to Karen's brother-in-law in the community event slush fund. When Karen was finally given a chance to speak, it was a disaster. She tried to defend herself, but her arguments were weak and self-pitying. She blamed me. She blamed disgruntled residents. She blamed the media. She took no responsibility. She showed no remorse. Every word she spoke only solidified the residents' resolve. The vote was taken by paper ballot. The result was overwhelming. 92% voted in favor of recalling the entire board. Karen Miller's reign was officially and humiliatingly over. As she walked out of the auditorium to a smattering of sarcastic applause, I felt not triumph, but a quiet sense of relief. It was the feeling of a long, early fever finally breaking. The weeks following the recall meeting were a whirlwind of change and legal maneuvering. The lawsuit Dave had filed was resolved with surprising speed. Faced with irrefutable evidence of malfeasance and a public relations nightmare of their own making, the HOA's insurance company was eager to settle. They agreed to pay all of my legal fees, a significant sum in damages for the harassment, and most importantly, they agreed to all of our non-monetary terms. The settlement stipulated that Karen Miller, Gary Peterson, and Brenda Howe were permanently barred from ever serving on an HOA board in any community managed by that national company again. They were also required to pay a portion of the settlement out of their own pockets, a painful and public consequence for their actions. The most satisfying clause, however, was the one requiring a formal, front-page apology to me and the community in the next HOA newsletter, acknowledging the historical significance of the Caldwell station and admitting the board's gross overreach. A new interim board was appointed, with Mr. Abernathy and Miguel Garcia agreeing to serve. Their first act was to declare an immediate amnesty on all outstanding fines levied by the previous board. Their second was to fire Karen's brother-in-law's landscaping company. Their third was a complete, line-by-line review of the bylaws, with a promise to bring proposed changes to the community for a vote, aimed at eliminating the vague, subjective rules that had allowed for so much abuse. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost overnight. People were talking to each other again. There was a sense of shared purpose, of a community that had taken back control from a tyrant. The Liberty Crossing Homeowners for Reform group became the unofficial new town square, a place for organizing neighborhood cleanup days and welcoming new families. As for me, I had a decision to make. What to do with the settlement money? It felt wrong to just put it in the bank. It was blood money in a way, earned through stress and conflict. I wanted to use it to create something positive, something lasting. I contacted Arthur Vance at the State Historic Preservation Office and told him my idea. He was thrilled. We worked together along with a local historian and a landscape architect to design a proper historical marker for the site. I used the funds to hire a stonemason to build a respectful, low-profile fieldstone path from the edge of my lawn to the entrance of the root cellar. We commissioned a heavy cast bronze plaque mounted on a solid granite block. The text, which Mr. Abernathy helped me write, told the story of the Caldwell station, of its role in the Underground Railroad, and of the brave people who sheltered there on their journey to freedom. The final scene of this strange drama took place 6 months after that first confrontation. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the entire community was gathered on my lawn for the dedication of the historical marker. The new HOA board was there, along with the mayor of our small town, and a color guard from my local VFW post. Dave Martinez drove down from the city for the event. Even the news crew came back for a follow-up story, this time a positive one. After a few short speeches from the mayor and Mr. Abernathy, it was my turn. I stood before the crowd, not with a binder of legal documents, but with a few simple, handwritten notes. I spoke about what the land meant to my family, not just as property, but as a repository of memory and duty. I talked about how the fight wasn't just about a root cellar, but about the principle that no amount of petty regulation can be allowed to erase history or crush the spirit of a community. I thanked the neighbors who had stood with me, who had found their own courage to speak up. This plaque, I said in closing, my hand resting on the cool bronze, isn't just for a historic place. It's for a historic moment in our neighborhood. It's a reminder that when good people stand together, they can't be beaten. After the ceremony, as people milled about, reading the plaque and talking, Mr. Abernathy came and stood beside me. We looked out at the scene, kids running on the lawn, neighbors laughing, a community that felt more connected than ever. You know, he said, clapping me on the shoulder, in a way, we all owe Karen Miller a thank you. I raised an eyebrow. How do you figure that, Arthur? He smiled. Her obsession with destroying that little piece of history forced all of us to discover it, to cherish it, and to come together to protect it. You didn't just save a root cellar, Mark. You saved a piece of our soul. Her tyranny inadvertently built the very community she sought to control. I thought about that. He was right. The irony was perfect. Karen's lust for absolute power over a dirt hole had resulted in her total ruin, while simultaneously elevating that same dirt hole to a celebrated local monument. She had wanted conformity and control, and in the end, she had unintentionally forged a stronger, more resilient, and more united neighborhood. I looked over at the stone entrance to the cellar, no longer an eyesore or a violation, but a symbol of endurance. The fight had been long and draining, but standing there, surrounded by friends and a restored community, I knew it had been a fight worth having. Justice had been served, and something far more valuable had been built in its place.